heart too quiet. The doctor back in Abilene said she would not see her first birthday without proper medicine, warmth, and food. Selene could barely afford a stale biscuit. Her husband had died before the girl was born, crushed under a wagon, no family left, no prospects. Just a baby with wide, solemn eyes and a cough that rattled through the night. "Ma'am," a voice pulled her from the haze of exhaustion. A man, tall and clean, stood in front of her. Dressed in a black vest and polished boots, he looked like he belonged in a bank ledger, not out here in the wild. His horse stood tethered behind him, the animal's coat gleaming like oil. "You Selene Lawson?" she blinked. "Yes," he tipped his hat. "I am Oscar Merrick. I own the Broken Rock Ranch east of town. My foreman saw a notice tacked up in the post, a mother seeking help for her child. Said she'd work in exchange for shelter." He looked down at the bundle in her arms. "That still stand?" Selene's throat tightened. "Yes, I will clean floors, cook, whatever you need." "I do not need a maid," he said simply. "I need a wife." "What?" Oscar nodded toward a buggy parked nearby. "I can afford doctors, food, a warm bed. But the town council is making noise about settling taxes on my land. A married man has advantages. A family steadies a reputation. You need help. I need a name on paper. No strings beyond that." Selene's heart beat like a drum in her ears. "You would marry a stranger." "You are not a stranger," he said. "You are a mother. That tells me all I need." She looked down at Francis. The baby's lips were pale, her breath shallow. One more night in the cold might be too much. Selene tightened her hold and made her decision. "Then I will be your wife." They married that afternoon in the back room of the town church, with a retired minister and a ranch hand as witness. Selene held Francis the whole time. Oscar's hand was steady when he slid the ring on her finger, plain silver, no decoration. They did not kiss. They barely spoke. The ride out to Broken Rock took hours, the sun setting low behind them, painting the land in fire. The ranch sat in a wide valley backed by pine-covered hills. The house was large, built from stone and timber, warm light shining through the windows. A doctor was already waiting by the door. Selene hovered, heart in her throat, as Francis was examined. The doctor's face was unreadable. "She is underfed, weak from the cold." He glanced up. "But she can pull through with care." Tears spilled from Selene's eyes before she could stop them. She turned away, wiping them fast. Oscar stood in the corner, arms crossed. He nodded once. "She stays in the main house. You both do." Selene looked up. "You do not have to, I do," he said. "You are my wife now." That night she slept in a real bed for the first time in months. Francis curled beside her, warm under a thick quilt. In the room across the hall, Oscar lit a lamp and read quietly. He did not intrude. Days passed. Selene rose early, helped the cook, cleaned when she could. But mostly she sat with Francis, feeding her spoonfuls of milk and broth, singing low songs when she coughed. Oscar was quiet, always watching, always just near enough. One afternoon she found him outside fixing a fence, sleeves rolled up, sweat streaking his neck. She hesitated, then stepped closer. "You do not speak much," she said. He wiped his brow. "Never saw the point in words unless they mattered. You did not have to help me." He looked at her, his eyes a deep brown, steady and hard like the land itself. "I know." That night Selene found fresh flowers in a jar by the window. Weeks passed. Francis began to laugh, soft at first, then full and bright. Her cheeks pinked up and the cough faded. Selene started to breathe again. She watched Oscar more, how he spoke to the ranch hands with respect. How he read aloud to Francis when he thought no one was listening. How he watched the horizon like it carried something precious. One evening, Selene stood in the kitchen watching the sun set. Oscar came in, quiet as always. She did not look at him. "I never thought I would feel safe again," she said softly. He stepped beside her. "You are," she turned to him. "Why are you so kind to us?" He hesitated. "Then you remind me what matters." Selene's breath caught. Oscar reached out carefully and brushed a curl from her face. His hand lingered. "I did not marry you to fall in love, but sometimes things grow where you do not expect." She stared at him, heart thudding. "I see you, Selene," he said. Not just the mother, not just the woman who needed help, I see you. Her fingers closed around his. And for the first time since her husband died, since the world crumbled to ash, Selene let herself lean in. She let herself hope. Oscar didn't come in for supper that evening. Selene noticed his plate untouched on the sideboard, the lamp above it still burning low. She didn't ask the housekeeper where he'd gone. Instead, once Frances was settled in her cradle and the fire had burned to soft embers, she pulled her shawl close and stepped out onto the porch. The moon hung low, caught behind a thin veil of cloud, casting the whole valley in a silver hush. Wind moved through the grass with a sound like whispered breathing. She followed the slope behind the barn, the one Oscar always took when he saddled up after dark, never saying where he went. She found him sitting on the ridge above the cottonwoods, his hat beside him, elbows resting on his knees. He didn't turn when she approached, but he shifted just enough to leave space beside him. She sat folding her legs, her skirt brushing dry sage. "I heard a letter came in from Cheyenne today," she said. He nodded once. "County assessors backing off. Won't be taxing the southern range till next year, long as I prove the land's in use. You'll have no trouble with that. Still have to build another line of fence before June, and hire another pair of hands." They sat with the quiet. The land stretched wide below them, broken only by the dark line of the creek. "I never knew folks could live this far out," she said, her voice low. "Feels like the end of the world." Oscar's hand brushed a pebble from his boot sole. "Sometimes that's the only place to start over," she turned to him. "Is that what you did?" His jaw worked before he answered. "My brother died in the war, left me the land. I didn't know what to do with it, not at first. But I figured if I built something solid, maybe it'd mean he hadn't died for nothing." Selene looked down at her hands. "Frances was born in a storm. I thought she wouldn't breathe at all. When she did, I started praying, not because I believed it would change things, but because I didn't know what else to do." Oscar's voice was quiet. "You don't need to pray anymore." "I still do." She glanced at him. "But now I ask for different things." He didn't press her to say what, just shifted closer, shoulder brushing hers. The next week, Oscar left early and came back with a small rocking chair lashed to the back of the wagon. He dropped it quietly near the hearth and disappeared into the stable before she could thank him. She traced the smooth wood, the curved arms, the careful joinery. Later, she found him in the corral, checking the gate latch. "Where'd you find it?" she asked. "Widow outside Elk Mountain had it in her shed, said it was hers when she was young. I traded 2 sacks of oats and a wheel hub." "You didn't have to do that." "I wanted to." She stepped forward. "You're not the man I thought you were when we met." He didn't look surprised. "And what kind of man did you think I was?" "One who needed a name on a line." Oscar straightened. "That was true." "So is this," she said, her hand finding his. That night, as she rocked Frances in the chair, her daughter's lashes fluttering against her cheeks, she caught Oscar watching from the doorway. He didn't move, didn't speak, just stood with his arms folded, eyes soft in the lamplight. The next morning, Frances reached for him when he passed. He stopped mid-stride, bent without hesitation, and lifted her into his arms. She gurgled, delighted, pressing both palms to his face. Selene stood transfixed, heart catching against her ribs. "She likes your beard," she said. Oscar looked down at the baby, his mouth curving slightly. "Good thing I never shaved it. Seems like she's claimed you." He met her gaze. "Seems like she's not the only one." Selene felt something shift in her chest, something long frozen, beginning to thaw. That evening, she brought her sewing nearer the fire where he sat reading. She didn't ask to share the light. She didn't need to. He reached over, pulled the lamp a few inches closer to her side. After a long moment, he said, "I never expected this." She kept her eyes on the hem she was mending. "Expected what, this us, that it might feel?" "Right," she set the needle down. "You think it does?" He nodded once. "Yes, it does." Selene folded her hands, the silence between them soft, not empty. "I don't want this to be a convenience anymore," she said. "Not for either of us." He looked over. "Neither do I." She stood, walked to him, and laid her hand over his. I married you to keep her alive, she said, but I stayed because you made me feel like. She leaned down, touched her forehead to his. Then let's live like it. He pulled her gently into his arms. No rush, no fire. Just the quiet certainty of something deeply earned. The wind carried the scent of thawing creek beds and pine sap as April stretched longer into spring. Snow still clung in the shadows of the northern hills, but the days warmed and the land softened underfoot. Selene stood with her sleeves rolled, hands sunk in bread dough, when Oscar returned from the south pasture late one afternoon, his boots heavy with clay. "You've been out since dawn," she said, glancing up from the work table. "South fence gave out farther than I thought, water running high under the posts." He set his gloves on the bench near the back door and leaned a moment against the frame. "I'll need to send someone to haul stone from the lower quarry, the bend near the salt lick's starting to slide." Selene dusted flour from her hands. "You'll need more than one man for that. The slope's too slick to manage with just reins and hope." He tilted his head, watching her. "You've walked it twice. Once last week when I was looking for willow bark, the other when Francis wouldn't quiet unless I kept moving." He gave a low hum, then stepped closer. "You feel safe out that far?" "I do now." Oscar's eyes held hers a beat longer than usual before he reached for the crock of water on the shelf. She turned back to folding the dough, pressing it gently into the pan. Later, after supper, she saw him lingering near the hearth where Frances had drifted to sleep in her small cot, one arm flung over her head. He crouched beside her without a word, adjusting the quilt where it had slipped from her shoulder. Selene stayed at the doorway, unseen. When he rose, she was waiting behind him. "She's stronger than I ever imagined she could be," she said softly. He looked down at the girl, then back to Selene. "You taught her how?" She reached for his hand. "We both did." That night she lit a single candle in their room, the flame flickering as she brushed out her hair. Oscar stood in the doorway, his shirt half unbuttoned, the collar damp from where he'd rinsed his face. He didn't speak, just watched her in the quiet. She turned to face him, brush falling still in her hand. "Have you ever thought about what comes next?" she asked. He stepped inside, the wooden floor creaking gently beneath his weight. "I've thought about what I'd like to come next." She waited. "I want to build you a garden," he said. "A real one, not just the kitchen patch, with roses along the house and rows of vegetables you don't have to weed in the dark." Selene's throat tightened. "Why?" "Because you belong here. And I want it to feel like yours." She crossed the room and pressed her forehead to his chest, the fabric of his shirt still warm from the day's sun. "I've never belonged anywhere," she whispered. "You do now," he said, "if you'll let yourself." Spring settled in earnest the following week. Frances took her first steps between the porch and the corral, arms outstretched, a squeal of joy bursting from her lips when she reached Selene's skirt. Oscar, standing nearby with a coil of rope slung over his shoulder, froze mid-step. "She's walking," he said, as if the ground had shifted under him. "She is," Selene replied, laughing, lifting the girl into her arms. Frances turned toward Oscar and reached, fingers opening and closing. He didn't hesitate. He pulled off his gloves and took her, cradling her against his side as if he'd done it 100 times. That night, after the lamps were blown out, Selene lay beneath the quilt, listening to the whisper of wind through the shutters. Oscar's hand found hers beneath the blanket. "I want to take you to the river," he said into the dark. "There's a place where it runs slow and the cottonwoods lean over the banks. I used to go there when I needed to remember peace." She turned toward him. "Will you take us tomorrow?" He kissed her knuckles. "Yes." The next day, with baskets packed and Frances bundled against the breeze, they rode out. The wagon rolled through narrow ravines and sunlit clearings until the land opened to a meadow dotted with blue phlox. The river curved wide and lazy, soft against the rocks. Selene spread a quilt near the water's edge while Oscar tethered the horses. Frances sat between them, chasing shadows with her hands. "I used to think happiness belonged to other people," Selene said, watching the girl. "People who hadn't lost so much." Oscar plucked a blade of grass, twisting it slowly. Maybe it finds the ones who know what to do with it. She looked at him, eyes steady. I was afraid to love again. I wasn't, he said. Not once I met you. Selene reached over and laid her hand on his chest, where his heartbeat thudded strong beneath the fabric. I love you. His hand covered hers, fingers lacing firm. And I love you. Frances laughed then, bright and sudden, as a butterfly landed near her shoe. Selene leaned into Oscar's side, the warmth of him anchoring her to the earth. She closed her eyes and breathed deep. Here in this quiet bend of river with her child safe and her heart open, she had everything she never dared believe she could have. And it was real. The barn roof needed re-shingling after the last hailstorm. Oscar hadn't said as much, but Selene noticed the way he paused beneath it each time he passed, his eyes tracking the darker patches where the boards had swelled and warped. She waited until Frances was napping in the sunlit corner of the parlor, then stepped outside with a tin of coffee and 2 enamel mugs. Oscar was on the ladder, hammer in hand, sleeves rolled to his elbows. He looked down when the screen door creaked. "You planning to climb up here and help?" he asked. "I brought coffee. That seems like the more sensible contribution." He took the mug she held up and crouched on the roof's edge. She stayed at the base of the ladder, leaning against the rail, watching him drink. "Do you miss town?" she asked. He wiped his mouth with the back of his hand. "Not often. You lived there before the ranch, for a spell. After the war, did some work with timber, helped haul freight out to Fort Sanders. Too many people packed too close together. Always felt like I was breathing air someone else had already used," she smiled faintly. "I used to think I'd live in a city. St. Louis maybe, somewhere with marble steps and gaslights. I read novels about women who wore gloves in summer and had opinions about opera." He tilted his head, gaze curious. "What changed?" "My mother died. My father couldn't manage without her, so I stayed, took care of the house. Then I met Ben and the rest came fast." Her voice caught. "After he passed, I couldn't think about cities anymore. I just needed to keep her breathing." Oscar studied her quietly. "You still miss him." "I miss the idea of what we might have had, but truthfully we barely had time to know each other." She looked up. "I didn't expect to feel more with someone I married out of necessity." Oscar came down the ladder, each movement sure. When he reached the ground, he set his mug aside and stood in front of her. "I've never asked much about your life before," he said. "Not because I didn't want to know. I just didn't want to touch anything that still stung." Selene reached for his hand. "It's eased. You're part of the reason why." They stood like that, hands joined, the warm wind tugging at the hem of her skirt. That evening, she found him in the back room sorting tools, his shoulders hunched over the workbench. "I'd like to know more about your brother," she said. Oscar didn't look up right away. "Daniel was younger. Wild when he was little, always tearing through the fields like the world was a race he was trying to win." "Did he want to fight?" "No," Oscar said, straightening. "But our father did. Said it would make men of us. I went east. Daniel followed me 2 years later." "He never made it back." Selene stepped closer. "You carry him with you." "I try to build something he'd be proud of. I don't know if that's the same as peace, but it's steadier than grief." She reached out and touched his forearm. "You've built something strong. And not just with timber and stone." His eyes met hers, steady and open. "I meant it when I said I wanted the garden for you, but I also want it for her, so she can grow up knowing beauty isn't just something you dream about." Selene smiled. "Then let's plant it together." The next morning, they laid out a plot behind the house. Oscar tilled the soil by hand, while Selene measured rows with a knotted cord. Frances sat nearby in the grass, banging 2 spoons against a pot lid. They planted beans and beets, a row of marigolds along the path. Selene pressed her palms into the earth and felt the warmth soak into her skin. By early summer, the shoots had sprouted, and Frances was walking barefoot across the porch, her laugh trailing in her wake. One afternoon, Oscar came in with a box of apple seedlings wrapped in burlap. "These'll take years to bear," Selene said, peeling back the cloth. "Good, that means we'll be here to see it." She looked up, heart thudding once. "You want to stay here forever, with you?" Oscar asked. Yes, she stepped into his arms without hesitation. Then let's make it ours. And they did, piece by piece. Day by day, the land flourished under their care, the house filled with warmth that hadn't been there before. And Selene, who had once only hoped her daughter would survive, now dared to believe in a life where love wasn't borrowed but built. The last frost passed in early May, breaking beneath 3 days of steady rain. When the sun returned, the earth turned lush and soaked, and the cottonwoods filled out with pale green leaves. Oscar built a low fence around the garden, not to keep anything out, but to mark it off like something sacred. Selene stitched muslin cloths to shade the tender seedlings from the high mountain light. Frances toddled between them both, her feet brown with soil, her small hands always reaching toward new things. Oscar came in from the west pasture one evening with a broad smile tucked under his dust-streaked face. "Carson's boy is back from Illinois," he said as he washed at the pump. "Learned smithing back east, wants to open a forge near the station." Selene wrung out a cloth. "That'll bring more folks through, maybe even a proper doctor." "Maybe," Oscar said, drying his hands on his trousers, "but I was thinking about something else." She watched him as he leaned against the porch railing. "We could take some of the extra from the spring herd," he said. "Trade for a piano." Selene blinked at him. "A piano," he tipped his head. "You hum when you cook. I figure your hands would know the keys if they had the chance." She stepped closer, touched his arm. "You'd trade cattle for that," he looked at her steady. "I'd trade more than that." Selene pressed her forehead to his shoulder, her voice caught low in her throat. "I haven't touched one since I was 15. "Then it's time." That same week, Oscar rode out and returned 3 days later with a wagon groaning beneath a walnut upright, its polish dulled but keys intact. Selene stood on the porch with Frances tucked against her hip, watching as he and 2 ranch hands eased the instrument into the parlor. Later that night, after Frances had fallen asleep with her cheek against Selene's knee, Selene lifted the fallboard and laid her fingers on the ivory. She played a slow hymn she remembered from childhood, each note soft but sure. When she turned, Oscar was leaning in the doorway, arms crossed, listening. "I didn't know you could still play like that," he said. "I didn't either." He crossed the room, knelt beside her, and placed his hand over hers on the keys. She turned her palm, laced their fingers together. In the weeks that followed, she played each evening while he rayed beside the hearth. Frances would sway near the rug, humming tunelessly, her head bobbing. The house filled with sound, not loud but alive. One afternoon, Selene brought Oscar a letter that had arrived from Cheyenne. He opened it at the table, eyes scanning the page. "They've approved the new land grant," he said. "That stream bed behind the third ridge, it's ours now." She sat down across from him, hands folded. "That's good. It means we can build something more permanent for the hands, a proper bunkhouse, maybe even a schoolhouse someday." Her brow lifted. Thinking ahead, he leaned forward. "I want her to have more than what we had," Selene nodded. "Then we'll give it to her." That night, after the lamps were out and the house had gone still, Oscar reached for her hand beneath the covers. "I never told you what I thought the day I saw you standing at that station," he said. She turned to face him in the dark. "Tell me." "I thought you looked like someone who'd already survived the worst, and I wanted to be the one who made sure you never had to do it alone again." She drew his hand to her heart. "You have." In the months that followed, the ranch grew quieter in its steadiness. The fences held. The garden bloomed, and Frances learned the names of every flower in it. Selene hung fresh linens in the sun and stitched new curtains for the parlor windows. Oscar took to rising early, finishing chores before breakfast, so he could walk the pasture with Frances on his shoulders. She'd point at birds and call them by color, and he would tell her stories about the land, about how her uncle once chased a calf 2 miles on foot and never caught it. One morning, Selene found Oscar sitting in the orchard behind the barn, a folded paper in his lap. "What have you got there?" she asked, brushing apple blossoms from her sleeve. He handed it to her. "County notice. They're surveying for a new rail spur. Might cut through the far edge of the valley." She read the lines, her brow furrowed. It'll bring more people, he said. More trade, maybe more trouble, she looked up. And what do you want? I want to stay right here, he said. With you, with her. I don't care who else comes. She sat beside him, the paper fluttering between them. Then we'll hold the line, together. Oscar turned to her, his eyes